Hi, this is a conversation with Robin Hanson. He is Research Associate at the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford University, and he is also Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Robin, does it surprise you that governments rot?
No, but I want to understand much more detail how and when they rot. If you think about biology, basically, biospheres grow and evolve and improve, but individual organisms rot. Even individual species rot. In our society, firms rot. That is, as firms get older, they grow more slowly. Empires apparently rot. We have a history of empires rising and falling. It looks like legal codes rot. Sometimes, that once upon a time in the Roman Empire, Justinian, the emperor, decided to revamp the whole legal code because they thought it was a mess and he was rotting and he was trying to simplify it. And in the world of software, where I spent 9 years, software rots. I don't think most people know this, but almost all large software systems slowly get worse over time. They get fragile and harder to change, and eventually they have to throw them away and start all over from scratch, which is terribly expensive. So large, complicated systems seem to consistently rot. Firms, organisms, empires, legal codes, software rots. But the things that don't seem to rot, entire biospheres, maybe entire species, competitive industries with many different firms competing with each other to try to improve things, maybe a world with different nations improves as the nations compete. So we see some kinds of things, when they have lots of competing elements, improve and grow over time. Those don't rot, they get better. And then we see other complicated structures, organisms, firms, software systems, they rot consistently. They just get worse over time, and then they have to be thrown away. And so this is a key question about the systems we are building and growing in our world today. Which of them will rot? And how expensive and painful will that be to throw them away and replace them? For example, our entire legal code, is it rotting? Will we have to throw away our legal code at some point and start over from something much simpler? Our many software systems rot, as you know. You might have an Apple and enjoy the software, but it's rotting over time. Eventually, you may have to get rid of that with something simpler. Our regulatory codes can be rotting. It's well known, for example, that the nuclear power has gotten more expensive over time as regulators have added more and more rules and regulations about how to handle nuclear power. And so it looks like that regulations have gotten so overbearing and complicated that it's rotting. It's getting worse. And so if I can imagine a world of many different competing nations or firms or something, I less have to worry about any one of them rotting, right? Because one rots and dies, will be replaced by others. But what if we make things at the global scale? Global organizations or global practices or networks, if those rot, how will we replace them? Can we replace them?
How do you know that government is rotting? It's easy to know when an apple is rotting, but...
Right. Well, we have seen empires rot, and the question is how much of that is due to government rot, and we don't know. We do know that many systems have rotted within government. That is, government agencies often seem to get older and more decrepit and harder to change, but it's hard to know. And so talking about governments rotting is more speculative compared to the things we see more concretely that they rot. But it's in some sense more important to wonder whether the big shared things we share. So for example, think of medical ethics or medical regulation, right? It actually turns out that this is surprisingly coherent across the world. That is, we have a world community of people who do medical ethics who pretty much push the same rules and regulations everywhere. And as those rules get more complicated and change, if they're rotting, then the world of medical ethics is rotting. Similarly, for say, nuclear power is regulated pretty similarly around the world. There's lots of areas in our life where perhaps the whole world is rotting together because we're all doing it the same and we're all building up these more complicated adaptations and variations that create more interdependencies. And I worry that in a lot of important areas, the world is rotting.
And when you say you're worrying, how does these worries materialize?
Well, I talk to people like you or other people at the conference I'm coming here to, and I think about the long-term consequences. So what actually brought me to this was thinking about the very long-term future of humanity and what sort of things could bring us down. And I've realized that humanity has this enormous future potential, that is, we could go out into the stars and become vast and do many things. But many people don't think that's likely to happen. They think that we'll have a limited time period and go away. One way that could happen is if we do some sort of suicide or destructive, kill ourselves, but that's actually pretty hard to do. But if you think about one of the other ways we could go wrong is we could create some sort of global regulatory structure government that just locked us down and said, no, you're not allowed to change, you're not allowed to expand, you're going to have to stay here because it was more comfortable that way. And that's a real risk in our long-term future, I think.
You mentioned things that can stop us or lock us down.
Yes.
Is this stasis dangerous for humanity?
Well, it's dangerous in precluding our potential. So for example, imagine we have more of a world government 1,000 years from now, okay? We will see many benefits from that. Maybe we'll have much less war between states. Maybe we'll deal with global problems like global warming, maybe we'll promote innovation. We will see that we have all these benefits from this world government. And then somebody might say, I want to go to another star system. And the government might say, well, if we let you do that, then we'll lose control of you. And then people will leave in other directions. And then the universe will no longer have a nice central control that keeps everything managed. And maybe they'll say, no, we don't want that. We like this world where everything is coordinated and controlled from the center in a way that like everybody likes and can vote on, et cetera. And they don't want people to leave and go away. And so they may prevent that. Because the moment many people go away from here far away, central control is gone. It's no longer possible. We go to a world of competition where these various sources fundamentally compete and can't be brought back under control.
So in the context of this COVID pandemic, how does this situation is reflected in our current situation?
Well, I think it was very dramatic. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw the usual public health experts give the usual sort of advice. And then some other countries decided, no, we're going to do it differently. And then elites all around the world talked about that a lot. And they said, no, that's the way we should do it. And then pretty much everyone did it the same way. So we don't actually have that much variation in COVID policy around the world. Strikingly, we kind of have a world government that dealt with the pandemic in the sense that we have this worldwide community with strong pressures of conformity that basically made everyone do it the same way. And that's true in a lot of areas of regulation. We kind of have half a world government now. People don't quite realize that. Yes, the United Nations doesn't do anything, but these communities who all talk to each other, all the nuclear regulators talk to each other,
they all agree. Yes.
All the pandemic regulators talk to each other. They are part of a world community where they each want to be respected by the other people in that community. That's the primary place they identify with. And those communities basically agree together on how the world should go, and everyone does it the same. And that's reducing our range of exploration. So you might think one of the things we could have from a big world is different people doing things different ways, and then we might find out what works best by seeing the variation. We could, in principle, do that in many areas like nuclear power or aviation or pandemics, but if everyone does it the same way, then we're never really going to know how it could be done different and whether that works better.
This is sad.
It's sad, and it could also be a way things rot. As I said, if, say, nuclear regulations get more and more complicated and they're more and more limiting and they let you do fewer things and everyone adopts those same regulations, then in some sense the potential gets curtailed and we end up not being able to try out very many things.
Is there an antidote?
Variation. I wish perhaps we could have a prize every year for the country that's doing the most interesting, different thing in some policy areas. So for example, at the moment, Iran seems to be the leader in doing organ sales. In Iran, you can sell your organ. It's a government set price, but you're still allowed to do it. Nowhere else in the world are you even allowed to do that. And lots of other medical ethicists in the world say, boo, Iran, we must make Iran stop. We must exert pressure on Iran to stop doing this different thing. And I'd say, let's celebrate Iran for doing something different, in letting us see the possibilities.
Well, these, for example, I like these organ sales. How are these ideas received in the media, in the academia, according to your experience?
The media and academia, they tend to be voices of sort of the elites of the world who talk a lot together and agree a lot together. They all go to the same conferences, they all go to the same events, they talk a lot, and they form this shared opinion. The talking heads all around the world read the same articles in the New York Times or the same documentaries or go to the same conferences, and they all want to be accepted. They want to be liked by each other. And so when they form a consensus, then it operates on all of them. That is, it's hard to deviate from that consensus, and you might be accused of being evil and immoral and out of the Overton window and unacceptable as a candidate for some prestigious position. People might say, well, he's a smart person and he's interesting, but look at this thing he said. That's not the thing the rest of us think. You don't want somebody like that in this important position.
It also happens with anthropogenic climate change, for example.
Of course, right? And there, again, we don't actually have that much world policy. But so there's not that much to deviate from, but there's a lot of similar sort of discussions. But maybe we could think of, say, even genetic engineering. Like a few years ago, people were saying, well, China will do genetic engineering. They don't care what the rest of the world thinks. And then at some point, like a year or so ago, there was this report that somebody had actually done genetic engineering on humans and that they were trying out some big changes. And then the Chinese government said, no, that wasn't supposed to happen. And we're locking down, we're passing these laws, and we're going to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen because we in China are going to follow the same rules the rest of the world does on genetic engineering. And so, China is one of the places you might hope would do things different in many ways. And in a lot of ways, they don't want to actually stand out as different. They want to seem as they're part of the world community that accepts the larger world norms about how to do things.
Is it possible to ask, do you have a favorite innovations, favorite disrupt?
Things to try, yes.
Favorite things to try, yes.
Yes, there are many big things I'd love to try. So I'm especially a proponent of using betting markets for aggregating information, to collecting information, and in particular, that could be used for governance. And I've been trying to get people to do experiments, but so far, finding obstacles. So one of the things the world is common in regulating is against gambling.
Sure.
But laws against gambling prevent a lot of interesting experiments with financial market assets in aggregating information and helping to make decisions. So there are ways we could use betting markets or sort of different kinds of financial assets to basically ask a larger world, how should we make this particular decision? So concretely, imagine we have a company and we want to know, should we keep the CEO or should we dump him? And there's a way to ask a larger financial market that question exactly, except the anti-gambling laws and the securities regulations make that hard.
I read about this for elections, to predict the result of elections.
But we could do much better than predicting the election. We could ask who should win the election, right? So we could ask, who should you vote for? We could ask, say in the United States, there's the Republicans and the Democrats. We could ask, if the Republican becomes president, then how will the economy do? How will lifespans do? How will world respects do? We could ask about the consequences of a choice, like the Democrat or Republican president, for key outcomes we care about. That would be much more useful than just predicting who will win. It predicts who should win. And again, that's a sort of innovation that I wish some people would try, but hardly anyone has tried. And part of the obstacles is that is laws are against it, which are uniform across the world. You can't really find places in the world to make this trial go very easily, because places maybe you could try would be so small that it would be hard to get much infrastructure there to get things going. But this is one of our key problems, even in many areas of financial innovation, et cetera. The world agrees so much on regulation that it's hard to try things.
Well, let's talk about futarchy.
Futarchy is the idea of using conditional markets to advise decisions. So I just said we could have markets that advise us on whether to elect the Democrat or Republican, right? We could have markets on whether or not to fire the CEO. So the fire the CEO markets would be stock prices conditional on whether we keep or fire the CEO. That is, we'd have two prices, one price if we keep the CEO and one price if we don't. If the price, if we don't keep the CEO, is higher, that's the market saying you're better off dumping the CEO. And if we could make those prices, then we could get that direct advice about whether to keep or fire the CEO. So that's an example of what I call a decision market, asking speculators which decision to make. That is asking them, for a particular decision, which one gives you the best outcome when we have a certain outcome we've declared. So the idea is to do that for governance. So that is, we could have a form of government where we say, there's a current set of laws, and anyone can come up with a proposed alternative bill, i.e. a change to the laws, and then we will ask speculative markets, what do you think of this change? And we could ask them in terms of a national welfare measure. So for the company, we would use the stock price. We would say, should we fire the CEO? We'd say, well, let's look at the stock price if we keep the CEO versus if we dump them, because the stock price is our measure of the value of that company. For a nation, what we would do is pick a national welfare measure. It would be something like GDP augmented with leisure and national respect and public opinion, happiness, etc. And it would be some measure we've decided on what we want. And if this number is higher, it means we got more of what we want. And we would pick that measure. We would have legislators vote on the contributions to it. We'd have some agency that measured it, like say the Bureau of Labor Statistics does about GDP in the US today. And then we would have people bet or trade on, for any bill, if we pass that bill, do we get more national welfare than if we don't pass the bill? That is, we would always have two markets. The price if we pass the bill, the price if we don't. If the price if we pass the bill is higher, then we pass the bill. That would be the idea. So in this, the slogan here is vote on values, but bet on beliefs. We would vote on what we wanted, what outcomes we cared about to put in national welfare. How much do trees count? How much does lifespan count? How much do winning architectural awards count? And then the speculators would decide which bills would achieve that. They would tell us how to achieve the thing we want. And that would be futarchy. Futarchy would be a regime where we would vote on values, but on beliefs. We would have legislators figure out what we want, and then we would have speculators tell us how to get it.
When you talk about this, what is your favorite objection?
Well, the most realistic objection is that it allows not enough hypocrisy. People like to be hypocritical about their governments. That is, they like to pass laws that let them project an image of the kind of thing they're for or against. But they don't actually want to do it. They
like
just
virtue signaling or...
Yes, for example, people want to make prostitution illegal, but they don't want to try too hard to stop it. They just want to take a stance that it's a bad thing. Or say recreational drugs. They want to say it's a bad thing, but they don't want to try very hard to stop it. You might think, say, what's the value of trees in the national welfare function, right? So a lot of people would say, you know, they're cutting down too many trees. Trees are great. We need policy that keeps more trees and stops the trees from being cut down. Many people might like to say that, but they don't really want to cut down the trees if it comes at the expense of something they care about, like a hospital or power plant, because they want the power, they want the doctor. And so they just want to say they like trees without actually paying the cost. And today, our system lets them do that. They can say, I really like trees, and their politicians can say, you're absolutely right. I'm going to go to Washington, and I'm going to make sure we have more trees. I'm going to fight those anti-tree people. And they go there and say that, but they kind of know you don't mean it. And they will do some show of doing some symbolic things in that direction, but they won't actually do too much because you don't mean it, right? Under futarchy, you would put some weight and number on trees in the national welfare function. You would have to be open and honest, like this is how much we care about trees. And if you say we care more about trees, how that would turn out is you would raise the number, the weight on trees. And as soon as you raise the weight on trees, then the market speculators will say, okay, you want more trees? That's what you're rewarding us for predicting. Okay, this policy will achieve more trees, right? Don't build that hospital, because that will get in the way of the trees. And now you will in fact get more trees. But what if you don't like that? What if you just wanted to be hypocritical? A lot of times people like to be hypocritical, especially in politics. And my proposal, unfortunately, gets in the way.
Robin, if a student approaches you and asks, where can I read more about this? Do you have a recommendation? Book,
well,
website,
the topic
blog,
of futarchy handily has just one word, futarchy. Look up the word, F-U-T-A-R-C-H-Y, and you will see a lot of things written about that there. On the topic of rot, there's unfortunately not as much written as there should be. There's a lot of literature of software rot, of how there's a bit about empires rotting. But we don't have much of a literature talking about regulatory systems rotting or big international, communities rotting. And that's the reason I'm interested in talking and thinking about it, because it looks like we're missing a literature there.
Well, thank you, Robin, for sharing these ideas and these experiences with us.
Thanks
And
for
thank you
having
too.